Welcome back into Jocks 94.5's Countdown to Kickoff. Damian Mitchell alongside Conrad Van Order. We're back for another week to break down some of the most important matchups looking towards the SEC as we get closer to kickoff on Saturday. And we'll start off with the Auburn Tigers, Conrad. And for most of the week...
Why? There's nothing going on.
Oh, no, of course not. It's just a little quarterback situation here in week 3 of the college football season. And it started off the first drive against California. It seemed like the offense was just as normal as could be. It seems like you were rinsing and repeating everything that you had done at Alabama A&M. And from that first drive, the game never looked the same.
No, that's putting it nicely, I would say. But I think that's part of what maybe was so concerning for Auburn fans, or so just frustrating about the whole situation in the Cal game, is you lose 21-14, but you drive down the field. It looked fairly reminiscent of what we saw against Alabama A&M, right? You're just marching down the field, moving the ball at a good pace, Peyton Thorne making good decisions, distributing the ball well, and it all went south from there because after that first drive, he would have 4 interceptions remaining over the rest of the game. But that's what, you know, and we talk about this from time to time in different matchups on Morning Jocks, but the first drive is scripted. I think everyone knows that by this point. They're scripted. That's what they practice all throughout the week, so they know what they are going to do and how to execute when they go out there. And the fact that obviously they got that part figured out, but then when you're having to make adjustments in the game, you're having to go off script a little bit if you're Peyton Thorne, making calls at the line, making audibles, different things. Clearly there is a deficiency there. That is not something that is a strong suit of this offense right now. And fortunately, you are going up against a New Mexico team this week that has given up almost an average of 600 yards of offense through their first 2 games of the season. So hopefully this is a get-right game for you if you're Auburn in that Auburn offense. But all eyes are going to be on Jordan-Hare Stadium and who walks out with the first-team offense. Is it Peyton Thorne, as we expect, or is it Hank Brown? And then if it is Peyton Thorne, as we expect, how long do we have to get into the game before we see Hank Brown? Is it a offense struggling early turnover from Peyton Thorne? Are we going to go series for series? How exactly is that going to look? I think that's the big question for everyone, Damian.
Yeah, and if you watch the game against Cal with Peyton, there were moments in the game where you started to see the old Peyton Thorne, and it gets to a point, something that me and you had conversations about numerous times on Morning Jocks. The fact is, Peyton Thorne has played high-level football for 4 years now, at a high level, both at Michigan State and at Auburn. And he's hit that mark of the Cade Klubniks of the world, the DJUs of the world, of what he is presented on film is exactly who he is. There's no more of this, maybe Hugh Freeze can figure it out. You've had 15 games to this point to say, all right, Peyton's not the guy that we necessarily need for everything that we want to accomplish. Where Auburn fans and Auburn's real expectations are now at a crossroads from each other because of what your quarterback does. And I know a lot of things go into an account. Receivers not running the right routes, not getting their depth, Peyton's holding the ball too long. The offensive line had some issues, not establishing a run game with Jarquez Hunter. There's a lot of things that go into it. But at some point, if you're Hugh Freeze, you have to give Hank Brown a chance, because if you're going to go out and have a performance where you're 14 for 27, 100 some odd yards, 1 touchdown, and 4 interceptions, I would much rather just go in there with an unexperienced freshman, let him make the mistakes, and just hopefully we can correct them moving forward because of the more game reps that he gets. I think we see Hank Brown early, because I do think the leash is going to be extremely short for Peyton Thorne, because at this point, you can't keep going down this snowball, like the hill with the snowball of just it mounts up and mounts up. Because I will say this. After the first game, you really had to, when they say quality of competition, you really got to look at it for what it is. Alabama A&M, not a good FCS team. Auburn dominated. They looked flawless for a good bit of that game. But then when the real competition stepped up with Cal, and when you look at the rest of Auburn's schedule, you need to have consistency at that quarterback position in order to feel confident of what you have. And if your goals are to, potentially be an 8 to 9 win team, or, pull off these upsets against Georgia, Alabama, and et cetera, you got to have consistent play at the quarterback position. And it starts with Peyton.
It absolutely does. And I think a legitimate concern, if you're an Auburn fan, is You go out there against New Mexico, and Peyton Thorne looks great, right? It's similar to what you saw against Alabama A&M because New Mexico is not a good football program. They are one of the worst programs in all of FBS, and I don't mean that to knock New Mexico, but it's just to say if Peyton Thorne goes out there and lights it up like he did in week 1, if you're an Auburn fan, I feel like that might be the last thing you want to see, right? Because then that's only going to reinforce, what Hugh Freeze has said is, well, it's hard not to play the guy that performs the best in practice, but that's got to translate on the field. Well, if you now have 2 out of the 3 games where that translates and it's against the weaker competition, I think if you're an Auburn fan, that's the last thing you want to hear because that's only going to give, I guess, Peyton Thorne maybe more cachet there with that coaching staff of, well, we've seen him at his best and it's pretty good. So why can't he just go out there and replicate that? And if you're an Auburn fan, I think that's the last thing that you want because we know who Peyton Thorne is. You bring up DJU and Klubnik and some of these other guys. These are guys that are 4 or 5 years into their college football careers, right? We know who they are at this point, and the fact that some people don't want to call it that is quite frankly surprising to me because it is what it is. It doesn't mean that Peyton Thorne's not a good guy. It doesn't mean he's not a good leader. It doesn't mean that he can't have a future in the world of football. It just means that when you've seen a guy at the Power 4 level for now his 4th year as a starting quarterback, why do you really expect for anything else to change? And I think for Auburn fans, that's why you want to see Hank Brown, right? Show us. If there's really not a better option than Peyton Thorne, that's fine. But show it to us. Prove to us that we aren't the crazy ones for wanting to see a change at the quarterback position. And, we heard from Hugh Freeze. You mentioned it, but we heard from him earlier this week. He's going to be on a short leash. We've heard Hugh Freeze say, this is the last thing he thinks about when he goes to sleep at night and the first thing he thinks about when he wakes up in the morning. It's obviously weighing on him and that coaching staff because, let's be honest, he doubled down on the portal.
Yep.
He told everybody all throughout the summer, anytime people asked him about the portal, he continued to double down on why he did not want to go and spend money on the portal. And again, I will just say, I don't know the exact dollar amount, but we know that they spent a lot of money to bring Keandre Lambert-Smith over from Penn State. And he's been a good player for them, right? He scored touchdowns in both of the first 2 games. He is a good player to have on your roster. But I can't help but think that right now, maybe some of that money that went towards him, you might have been better off going and getting a guy through the portal that could at the very least have come in here and pushed Peyton Thorne, a guy with experience that maybe you felt a little better about to where last week you would have felt comfortable to pull Peyton Thorne and put somebody else in there. Because I can't, as an Auburn fan, I can only imagine how frustrating it was to watch the Cal game and go, Fernando Mendoza, that guy is better than anything we have. Oh, we couldn't have gone and got a guy like that out of the portal. But that's where you are. If you're Hugh Freeze in Auburn, you double down on Peyton Thorne. You backed him up. That's your guy. All right, well, now it's time to either eat crow or you have to figure out something very, very quickly with that offense.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And speaking of Fernando Mendoza, he goes 25 for 36, 233 yards, and 2 touchdowns against this Auburn defense, who I thought at moments was better in some spots, but there's still kind of some question marks in the secondary. They were able to apply pressure. One thing we talked about this week was Kendrick Falk. Like he's legit on the defensive side of the ball.
2 sacks, 3 tackles for loss. That is have a day, buddy.
Yeah, now he was locked in. If you look at the rest of the pieces, and I know DJ Durkin, it's early on, you're still figuring out some things, but it shouldn't have been as easy for Fernando to have a lot of those opportunities in the pass game. And I think, that's going to pay dividends later on when you have Taylon Green coming into Jordan-Hare, Jackson Arnold coming into Jordan-Hare. When you face up against not Stetson Bennett, Carson Beck, when he locks up on you in Athens and things. So for the secondary, I think this was a big wake-up call of, all right, if we don't have our ducks in a row, it's going to be a long, long season. And I think defensively, Auburn still needs to attack some things and maybe apply more pressure. And I know that kind of leaves your secondary in a little bit of some holes and things. But the more pressure you add on these quarterbacks, because it wasn't like Fernando Mendoza was fast, but when he used his legs, he was very effective. So a lot of these guys that you're going to see later on, you're going to have to figure some things out because it's only going to get harder from this point forward on Auburn's schedule. Because a lot of people in the preseason, to me included, we didn't see this Cal game going the way that it did.
No.
And you can use this New Mexico game as the get right. But again, you fall back into, all right, if Auburn looks flawless against New Mexico, do you have the same conversation when Arkansas rolls around? Then they put up, ungodly numbers on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, and that game is going to be very, very interesting. But you bring up, the secondary, we knew you lost a lot of talent, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of guys that have been around for a long time, and having a guy like Keontae Scott is very important. But it's going to take more guys than that. And you saw against Cal, they made some changes in the secondary in the second half. I know Antonio Kite came in there in the second half and played pretty well, the transfer from Alabama. And I know that's somebody we've heard maybe is going to get a little more, a bigger role in the secondary moving forward. But, outside of the receivers, which we heard about and we all knew they were going to be better, I feel like the group we heard the most about in terms of maybe exceeding expectations in the spring was the defensive line.
Yep.
And there were a lot of young guys that were going to have roles on that front. But you look at the guys like Jalen McLeod, somebody who transferred in last year and made a big impact. You have Isaiah Rakes, a guy that's very familiar with DJ Durkin coming over from Texas A&M, and really, really high expectations for him. And, we brought up Keldrick Falk. He had 2 sacks. That was great. That was it. He had the only 2 sacks on the day, and that's against Cal. So what's that going to look like when you go up against the trench play in the SEC? You're going to have to be able to put quarterbacks in uncomfortable situations, because Auburn is not a team, in my opinion, that's good enough to just go toe-to-toe with a lot of teams in the SEC right now. You need to be able to create turnovers. You need to put teams in, 2nd and 12s, 3rd and long situations to where you can get teams off the field, because they're just not talented enough to go straight up against a lot of these teams that are going to be on their schedule. So the defense has been, I guess, better than the offense overall, but certainly some room for improvement there. But all eyes going to be on Auburn and the quarterback situation.
Absolutely. If there's a main idea we can take away from this, Peyton Thorne, time to step it on.
Got to be better, buddy.
You have to. So when we return here on the countdown to kickoff here on Jocks, we'll take a look at the Alabama test on the road against Wisconsin. That game kicking off at 11 a.m. So we'll break that down. We'll return here on the Jocks countdown to kickoff.
Well, welcome back into Countdown to Kickoff here on Jocks 94.5. Conrad Van Order with you alongside my co-host Damian Mitchell. You can also catch us, if you haven't, on Morning Jocks weekdays from 6 to 7 here on Jocks 94.5, the Jocks app, and on YouTube now for Jocks Television. So appreciate all of you tuning in for the second week of Countdown to Kickoff. We just talked about Auburn and New Mexico. Of course, the Auburn quarterback situation, kind of the big story, at least in this part of SEC country throughout the week, Damian. But we have a big one for Alabama as they go on the road to Big Ten country. They're going to take on the Wisconsin Badgers and have really their first test. I mean, I guess we could say USF was a test after how that game went last week. Maybe a little unexpected for a lot of Alabama fans, but your first Power 4 game, you're going on the road against a Big Ten team, a Wisconsin team that still seems to be figuring out what their identity really is under head coach Luke Fickell now in his second year there. But a lot of people, you have this contingent of people saying, Alabama, the USF game, we saw this last year, and that kind of propelled them into the college football playoff. And we're going to see a new look Alabama on Saturday against Wisconsin. But then you also have the other people that go, man, turn the ball over a lot of penalties. Offensive line has some injury concerns right now. Maybe Alabama's on upset alert in some people's eyes going up to Wisconsin, but nonetheless, I think we're going to learn more about this Alabama team this Saturday against Wisconsin than we have through the first 2 weeks.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is things that you can control, things that you can work on to improve on. Like you don't expect the bad snaps. I felt like we had a lot of that last season. I thought you kind of flushed that out, but you saw it rear its ugly head.
Only one. It was only one.
Only one.
Only one.
Yeah. So
which is sad that that's an improvement, but it is.
Yeah, the quantity has gone down.
That's right.
Quality is still kind of, there's still some question marks, but I do think these are correctable mistakes for Alabama.
Absolutely.
Like I don't think that is something that is going to be a recurring theme as we continue. I think Alabama understands the challenge that Wisconsin possesses. I think defensively they're strong. And I think, they still have that old school Big Ten mentality where they will ground it out, make it a fist fight all 4 quarters. But I don't think Wisconsin offensively is as dynamic as Alabama is, because we've seen the sudden plays, the sudden explosive plays that Alabama possesses. So I think for Wisconsin, their biggest thing is going to be trying to slow the game down. And I think for Alabama, you saw even in moments against USF, they were able to sustain drives. They were able to still have those explosive here and there. But I think the pieces around this offensive line, because there's a lot of moving parts. Guys coming back from injury, guys having some bad tape on film, so they're putting other people in. So I think the cohesion of the offensive line is going to be key, because now you're going against the Wisconsin defensive front that there's some big boys. There's some big guys. You got to make sure that you're locked in on that point. And I think the run game, and something that I really do love, the fact that Nick Sheridan and Kalen DeBoer are truly letting their quarterback run. Like, they are calling design runs for Jalen Milroe to add to what they already have in the backfield with Jam and Justice as a two-headed monster. And for the defenses, you have to take all of that into an account of, all right, we may have, the coverage is down pat. We may finally apply some pressure. But when Jalen Milroe escapes that pocket, he's just as elusive. He's just as strong as another running back running the ball. And I think that's what's going to be key, because I do think in the passing game, the receivers, they're fine. They are good to go. Ryan Williams still looks like that dude. When you just put the ball somewhere around him, he still goes out and plays at a high level. But I think Jalen Milroe's legs are going to play a big factor, because I don't think Wisconsin athletically is still going to have to – they're going to be able to account for what Ford can do with his legs.
Yeah, and we saw that in week 1 against Western Kentucky, where he had multiple really big runs and made things happen with his legs. And something that you started to see later last year that has carried over, and we're already seeing it early in the season this year, is Jalen Milroe using his legs to move around in the pocket and step up. And you're at a position as a defense where you have to account for him scrambling, and that causes you to bring guys in, and it opens things up in the passing game. And we saw that with the passing touchdown to Kendrick Law in the first week. We saw that in the passing touchdown to Kobe Prentice last week. And I think that's something that continues to need to be utilized by Jalen Milroe in this offense. But I wonder if this is the week, are you going to see maybe more of an emphasis on the running game? Because we've seen, you saw it a little bit more last week with Jam and Justice, and we know the explosive playmaking ability that these guys have had. Both of them had huge runs and huge touchdown runs in the first 2 games. But with the offensive line, knowing the way that Wisconsin likes to play, do you kind of want to beat them at their own game? Because, again, this is a Wisconsin team that when Luke Fickell came in, they wanted to try to mix things up a little bit. You wanted to go a little more pass-happy, move a little bit more towards the spread offense style. But that clearly didn't really work for them. And now through the first 2 weeks, you can see that whether it's the limitations with Tyler Van Dyke at quarterback or just a change in offensive philosophy, they're kind of going back to that style, which is going to limit the time of possession for Alabama, the number of drives you can potentially have. And I just wonder if you're going to see a little bit of bully ball from Alabama on the ground, because we know the defensive front for Wisconsin isn't what it's been in the past. And you have Jake Chaney, their arguably their best defender overall, but their best linebacker, one of their starting linebackers, he's going to miss the first half because of targeting. Justin Jefferson also going to miss the first half on the Alabama side of things, but maybe not as much of an impact there. I just think that this is a game, from my perspective, I think Alabama matches up against Wisconsin way better than they did against USF, because we know what USF like to do. They had a mobile quarterback, and that's really where a lot of their offense came from. That's now not a threat going up against Tyler Van Dyke. This is a guy that threw 12 interceptions last year, and we know that turning the ball over, creating turnovers, is a major, major point of emphasis for Kane Womack in this defense this year. So I think that could end up coming up and being a big one. I'm not going to be surprised if maybe Alabama's a little slow out of the gate on the road. First time as a road team under Kalen DeBoer. It's, Camp Randall Stadium. It's a great environment. Jump around's going to be going crazy. But I think you see this team settle in and look a lot better than they did last week. And I think a big part of that as well is going to be the offensive line. I don't think Caden Proctor is going to be out there. Some people think he is going to be out there. But I think at the very least you're going to get Elijah Pritchett back. And as we saw against USF in those last 6 or 7 minutes, once he came in the game, Alabama blew the doors off of USF, and that offense looked completely different.
Yeah, and I think when you look at Alabama, even on the defensive side of things, USF posed some problems. And you talk about the mobility of their quarterback and Byron Brown, and I think what Alex Golish does offensively, it causes a lot of havoc for defenses anyway. And I wouldn't take too much into an account that, they did run for over 200 yards and things like that. But most of it was Byron Brown just trying to escape the passing routes. Like he was just trying to get out of Dodge and just run and get as much yardage as he could. But I think you still have to look at what they were still able to do in a 42-16 win. USF was 2 for 18 on third downs. That's a pretty good percentage.
It's very impressive from the defense.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. So if you can still find a way to, keep teams behind the chains and make them third to medium, third to long situations, that suits well for you. Because I agree with you. I think Tyler Van Dyke, we've seen what he can do. He's had good moments, but consistently overall.
Not to go back to what we were talking about in the first segment, but again, this is a guy that's been playing college football for a long time.
Exactly.
It's not the 2021 season anymore where he looked like the savior of Miami football.
Right. And I think we know what to expect with Tyler Van Dyke. And I think defensively for Alabama, you're going to have your opportunities to make some plays, because I do think at least the way I think this game is going to go, Alabama's going to be up by at least 10 to 14 at some point, and it's going to be a lot of Tyler Van Dyke almost pressing to throw the ball, and that wakes up the secondary. You see Damani Jackson, what he can do, Keon Sabb, who's been able to make plays back-to-back weeks, Malachi Moore and those guys. I think that the defensive secondary is probably licking their chops a little bit of like, okay, well, as long as our front seven does what they need to do, if Tyler Van Dyke throws this ball, we got this.
And I know it's a different caliber of matchup, but I look back at what you saw Texas do to Michigan last week, right? Mm-hmm. Where they came out of the gates firing on all cylinders, and it was very clear early in that game that Michigan, things had gotten out of hand for Michigan in terms of the way they wanted that game to be played and the way that they needed it to be played in order to pull off the win over Texas. And I think you could see something similar with Alabama and Wisconsin, because this is not a team that's built to come back from down double digits. And if you're Alabama and you can get out to a hot start early, like you're saying, make Tyler Van Dyke press a little bit, create some turnovers, it could end up being a little ugly up there in Madison, Wisconsin. But a good test for Alabama. Got to limit the penalties, though. 13 penalties for 120 yards last week, and you turned the ball over 3 times, and you got 0 takeaways. Those are things that are going to have to change for Alabama, but it'll be a big test as they take on Wisconsin in week 3. Then you get the bye week, and then we all know what comes next, that big matchup against Georgia in week 5. But there's a lot of other games going on around the SEC, College Game Day in SEC country, some other interesting matchups, maybe a couple of bottom dwellers in Texas A&M and Florida, as funny as that is to say, but a lot of other SEC games to get to. So we will break those down when we come back here on Countdown to Kickoff on Jocks 94.5.
Welcome back into the Jocks Countdown to Kickoff. Damian Mitchell alongside Conrad Van Order. Molly Wood holding things down behind the glass as we continue on the SEC slate of games, and we got a pretty nice one. College Game Day going to be out there at 11 o'clock. How about LSU and right now the undefeated South Carolina Gamecocks? The Fighting Shane Beamer sitting at 2-0, and
they have the best record in the SEC right now.
It's wild. It's wild. Going into the game with Kentucky, I don't know if I maybe had too high expectations for Kentucky or I just had too many unknowns from South Carolina. But by the end of the game, you realize South Carolina went up to Lexington and stood on business, as one Eli Drinkowitz would say. And it was, to me, it was an impressive performance because I honestly had no idea South Carolina had this in them, especially after the way they played Old Dominion.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody did. And, I mean, if you saw the clip from Shane Beamer, he made sure to let all the media people know, like, yeah, y'all were saying some not very nice things about this program. How do you feel about us now? And it's like, all right, big dog, let's wait until we get down the schedule here because, this game against LSU is going to be a whole different beast than what you've got in Kentucky last week, because defensively for South Carolina, you held Kentucky to 183 yards. You forced 2 turnovers. You didn't get too many penalties put on you. And so that was a very impressive performance. I will give them credit for that. Mm-hmm. But offensively speaking, I know you won 31-6. You had 250 yards of total offense. You were 3 of 10 on third down. You turned the ball over 1 time. You had Lenora Sellers throwing the interception. Sellers, 166 yards on 10 completions on 14 attempts, 2 touchdowns and a pick. Rocket Sanders, 13 carries for 54 yards and a touchdown. I mean, they're not bad numbers, but those to me are not, we're going to beat LSU numbers, because going into this game, right, you have to feel like if you're South Carolina, you're just trying to score points, because we know LSU is going to score points in there. Where they are vulnerable is defensively. And so if South Carolina, I mean, maybe if this was, and I know last year the offensive line was really bad, but at least last year you had Leggett, you had Spencer Rattler. Maybe if this was last year, I would feel better about South Carolina going into this matchup. And I know it's game day. There's going to be a great atmosphere there. There's going to have momentum coming off the Kentucky win. But Damian, I just don't know if I can see South Carolina being able to go toe-to-toe offensively with LSU, if defense is not a factor at all, I know LSU can go out there and put up 40 points without a concern. I don't think this South Carolina team is there yet.
I agree with you 100%. I think for South Carolina, last week was good, but you have to almost double that to be in contention with LSU. And I think for LSU, defensively, you almost look, I'm not going to say as bad as last year, but you're kind of leaning closer to that than you are really improving. I think offensively, what Garrett Nussmeier and a guy that you have been high on all summer long was, he could probably lead the league in passing. And right now he's kind of on that path of leading the league in passing. And I think offensively for Brian Kelly, that USC game, it leaves kind of just a big stain on where LSU is because I wasn't expecting USC to be more physical in certain areas. I just was not expecting that. And I think for LSU, since Brian Kelly's been there, they've gone through just this identity change. And the more I watch them, the more I'm like, where's the dominance? Where's the line it up? We're going to run this football with these guys. And I understand that your key pieces are Kyron Lacey, Garrett Nussmeier, what they do in the passing game. But really and truly, USC didn't necessarily quote unquote stop you from running the ball. I almost feel like you chose to stop running. And again, going to Nichols, quality of competition again, but to me, I think it gets to a point where you have to go back to what LSU really is and what their identity is that's the ground and pound. I understand what you're able to do passing the ball, but putting all the stress and stuff on Garrett Nussmeier to continue to almost bail you out of everything is going to run its course. And I think for South Carolina, if you're not able to put up points, it's going to be a dogfight because I find it difficult that if it becomes a shootout, that South Carolina is going to be able to hold up.
No, and they're just not. And Garrett Nussmeier, even though you did lose to USC, he's been spectacular so far on the year. 610 yards through the air, 8 touchdowns, just 1 interception through the first 2 games there. And you brought up the LSU run game. LSU's leading rusher this year is John Emery. And unfortunately, he suffered an injury after the first game in practice that week. That's their leading rusher. And you just played Nichols, and your leading rusher has 61 yards on the season, and he's only played in the first game, and he's not going to return this season. So that's something that they're going to have to figure out. Granted, I do think in this matchup, you can probably survive without that. That's something that as you get deeper into SEC play, that's probably going to be more of a factor, especially because, as we've talked about on Morning Jocks a number of times, you don't have Jaden Daniels anymore. So you lost last year. You could have withstood that, right? Because you had an 1,100-yard rusher under center, but now you don't have that luxury anymore. I just think it's going to be too much LSU going into this game, but it will be interesting to see if South Carolina is able to make it interesting, because I think that maybe is a cause for concern if you're LSU moving forward. The USC one, I think we can all admit USC's better than we were expecting, especially defensively. They made the kind of jump defensively that we needed to see LSU make, and it just hasn't been there yet. But still, it's hard to win SEC games on the road. South Carolina has the momentum. They're going to believe that they can win. Shane Beamers believes that they can win this game. It's 11 a.m. kickoff, early start. But still, I just think LSU is going to be a little too much for South Carolina, and they're going to be overmatched. And South Carolina is nothing against them, but they're going to look more like the team that we expected them to be coming into the year.
Yeah, I agree with you on that point as well. Continuing, Jock's caught down the kickoff. Let's look at the battle in the swamp. Florida and Texas A&M, 2 teams that
desperately need to win.
Exactly. This one game can kind of steer both these programs in different directions. Florida, after knocking off Sanford last week big, you get the DJ Lagway experience. You got McNeese with Texas A&M. You finally see good Connor Wickman. Again, think about the opponents that they were playing, and then you match that up of what they looked like week 1, and then you have a game in week 3 of, okay, one of these teams has to win. But right now for Florida, it's very similar to Auburn. You got a quarterback situation. Do you nurse Graham Mertz back to health? He had a concussion. Do you get him back out there as your starter, or do you just go with the juice right now that DJ Lagway is the guy? And for Texas A&M, this is your first time on the road. Now you got a chance to see. All right, we've seen what Connor Wickman looked like in week 1 against a. Now looking at Notre Dame, there's no telling where this team could be. But
granted, defensively for Notre Dame,
they're fine.
They're fine. It's just the offense, but still impressive. Yeah.
Now you have to get to a point of, all right, where are you going to hang your hat on of your identity offensively? Are you just going to make it a point of just take it off of Connor Wickman's shoulders? Let's run the ball. You got some quality backs in the backfield that can get it done. And then for Florida, again, you kind of, do you just consider Miami one of the better teams in college football that you just don't have the Jimmys and Joes? Then you look good against Sanford, but now you're going against a team that's probably somewhere around your level. So to be honest, Texas A&M may be favored, but I really don't even know which way I would sway it because it feels like day by day I'm convincing myself, oh yeah, Texas A&M should be able to run the ball against this Florida defense. Then I'm thinking, okay, well if DJ Lagway is there, Florida may empty the clip and just say, hey, you know what, we're gonna live and die with what he can do. So I'm going back and forth with these teams, but I think this is going to be, when we say like the pivot point for both of these teams, because a lot of the expectations moving forward are going to look exceptionally different depending on who wins and who loses this ball game.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And I feel like I understand why Texas A&M is the favorite in this game. I understand why people think that they're in a different spot, I guess, or a different tier of the SEC than Florida is. I just would have liked to see more from Connor Wigman against McNeese last week, because that was your get-right game, right?
Yep.
And you had 125 yards passing. And I understand in those kinds of games, you don't need to overwhelm them offensively. You can just kind of play your game and give what the defense or take what the defense gives you. But this was a guy that's now coming into his third year. He's had injury history, and all we've heard about is this is the guy for Tech. This is the real deal. He is the real deal. And to be fair, when we saw him, especially last year, he looked the part. He looked like he was coming along, and now it seems like there's been that step backwards. And maybe that's because you lost guys like Evan Stewart to the portal. You don't have that elite wide receiver, it doesn't look like right now. Maybe it's just a case of the new offense, the new coaching staff. It's just not a fit for him, whatever it may be. But that's a serious concern that I have with Texas A&M. And I think right now, if you're asking me going into this game that DJ Lagway, if he is the starter for Florida, I'd probably have more confidence in him just going out there letting it rip and being able to, maybe he'll turn the ball over, maybe he'll make some bad plays. He's a freshman. You expect that. But I've seen him make throws already, and I know it was against Sanford that I haven't seen Connor Wigman have to make in his college career so far. So this is going to be a very interesting game because, again, for Florida, wins are going to be at a premium for you this year. If you drop this one, I mean, seriously, I don't say this to be mean to them. There is a path for Florida where that Sanford game is the last time you see a W this year because their schedule is that difficult. And if you don't get things figured out at the quarterback position, it's tough. I know you got UCF left on your schedule, but that's really the only other game that I look at. Mississippi State, okay, but this is a team that to make a bowl game, I think at this point would be a miracle. And conversely, for Texas A&M, you want to prove that Jimbo Fisher was the problem, right? That's why we paid so much money to get rid of him, and we brought in a guy in Mike Elko. What's that fan base going to think? And I know it's year one, you have to give people time, but how long can they keep up with this? Because you've been going through this for so many years of building up this hype and building up this hype. And we did it again this year, didn't we? We had him in the top 25 going into the season. Yep. You lost, albeit to what we thought was a very good Notre Dame team at home in week one. But then they lose to NIU, and it completely changes how you view Texas A&M. They need this win really, really badly, or else they risk falling into the pitfalls of, great, are we going to go 6-6 again? Are we just the same as we were with Jimbo, with Mike Elko now? And it makes you wonder, what is the deal with the Texas A&M football program in Florida? I mean, if you probably need this one if you're going to make a bowl game and potentially save your coach's job.
Yeah, I'm telling you, man, if there's anything Taylor Swift taught me, these two teams are dancing with their hands tied, and I'll tell you that to say the least. Keep it locked right here on Jock's Countdown to Kickoff. We shall return as we do a deeper dive into SEC games this weekend. Keep it locked on Jock's 94.5.
Welcome back in to Countdown to Kickoff. A few more minutes here with Conrad Van Order, Damian Mitchell alongside me. Again, just a reminder, you can listen to us on Countdown to Kickoff every week during the college football season, but you can also listen to us all year long, weekdays from 6 to 7 a.m. for Morning Jocks on Jocks 94.5. And we have been breaking down week 3 of the college football season, Damian. You got Alabama going to Wisconsin, Auburn taking on New Mexico, game day in South Carolina as they take on LSU. A lot of good matchups across the SEC, but we have another interconference game going on, in a game that we talk ourselves into this one every year, don't we, Damian? With Georgia and Kentucky. Is this the year that Kentucky can finally pull it off against Georgia? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say no, especially after what we saw last week with the 31-6 demolition of the South Carolina had against Kentucky. Georgia, the big win against Clemson. Then you have a little bit of your cupcake matchup last week against Tennessee Tech, but now their first SEC matchup. Georgia, the number 1 team in the country, going on the road, though, to Lexington. Damian, is there any reason that you can see Kentucky making this one interesting against the Bulldogs?
Unless Carson Beck comes down with some sort of sickness, if the receivers all break their fingers, if the offensive line, eats a bad steak together as a unit. No, I have no faith
Speeding
in Kentucky.
tickets?
Yeah, I wasn't gonna say it, but hey, drive slow, homie. I think that for Georgia, they're just too dominant. And every year we have this conversation about Mark Stoops. And if anybody's listening to us on Morning Jocks, they know how I feel about Mark Stoops. He's one of the more overrated coaches in the SEC. But I think for what they want to do, they want it to be a fist fight all the time. But when you're going against the big dude on the block, you have to change your strategy. And Kentucky doesn't sway away from it. Think about a couple years ago, the now Tennessee Titan quarterback, Will Levis, we were thinking, oh, man, he's talented enough. He can go down to Athens and make it a ball game. They get beat to sleep. And it's like, okay, well, when are they going to get over this hump? And I don't think it's going to be this year. And I think for what we saw against South Carolina with Kentucky, there is nothing positive you can really take away from that tape. And then to follow that up with the number 1 team in the nation, welcome them into your backyard, I find it extremely difficult that Kentucky even makes this game close.
I just look at the quarterback play you got from Brock Vandagriff last week, 3 of 10 for 30 yards, and now you're going up against a Georgia defense that, I mean, call me crazy, but I would say Georgia's defense is better than South Carolina's, and we saw what they did to him last week. So I understand there's a little extra motivation, maybe a little bit of a revenge game for Vandagriff, of course, the former backup to Carson Beck, but I feel like that one's going to be sideways pretty early on there. Georgia, 24-point favorite. I'm not going to be surprised if they easily cover that spread as they head up to Lexington to take on Kentucky. We have another game, not an inter-SEC game, but a school here or a team here in Birmingham traveling on the road to SEC country to go play Arkansas in Fayetteville. You got the UAB Blazers taking on Arkansas. UAB, kind of like we talked about with Kentucky. The tape against La Monroe last week, probably not a whole lot that you can learn from that. It was pretty ugly. Arkansas, on the other hand, so close, Arkansas. You were so close to knocking off Oklahoma State. Ultimately goes to double overtime. You lose by 8. But we learned a lot, I think, about Arkansas, and particularly Taylon Green, the transfer quarterback from Boise State, looked great against Arkansas Pine Bluff in week 1. He absolutely lit it up last week. He is now the second leading passer in the SEC behind Jackson Dart, which is absolutely remarkable through 2 games. But he's been a revelation at the quarterback position for Arkansas. And if you had told me that they were going to let KJ Jefferson go to the portal, go join Gus Malzahn at UCF, and somehow find a player that is going to give them better production at the quarterback position, I would not have believed it, but that seems to be what they did in Taylon Green.
Yeah, and Taylon Green, first 2 games of the season, like we had heard during the offseason, and we had our question marks of, man, how will this Arkansas team look? And I know their record is 1-1, and there's not any should have beens or could have beens in football, but they should be 2-0 right now. I think it was more of Arkansas beating themselves up that continued to give Oklahoma State opportunities. That's what ended up beating them. Now, I do think Taylon Green, what he does with his legs, it's a lot different. You're not getting the quarterback powers with the KJ Jeffersons and things of such, but he's dynamic with his legs. He's not afraid to take shots around the field. He has quality receivers that are stepping up where they need to in certain situations. You have Jaquindon Jackson in the backfield who's been able to run the ball really well these past couple games. And for Arkansas, it's so difficult because you hear during the offseason, man, Sam Pittman's on the hot seat. Sam Pittman's on the hot seat. Well, the first couple of games in the season, you're like, man, if Sam can kind of iron some things out, this Arkansas team ain't going to be a slouch as the rest of their schedule continues to go up. I'll go forward in 2024. But I do think that they're not good enough to make the mistakes that they were making against Oklahoma State and still win a bunch of football games. Now, I do think for UAB, you beat up on Alcorn State on Thursday, but what happened down there in Monroe, Louisiana, just wasn't pretty at any level. And a team that going into the season, Louisiana Monroe barely picked to win 3 games the entire season.
And they dominated you
at every level, like lining up. And, a lot of kudos to Brian Vincent and what he's been able to do, former offensive coordinator and interim head coach here at UAB, and what he did with those guys. I mean, he pretty much gutted that entire roster, get new guys like, hey, man, pretty much, do you want to play? Come on down to Louisiana Monroe. And General Booty, a guy that we've seen, play at a bigger level at Oklahoma, but, he wasn't the starter. But he goes to Louisiana Monroe, gets some burn on the football field, and he does a great job. But I think for UAB, with this step up, I don't expect them to win, but I do think that if Dilfer and those guys can find a way to make it difficult, try to find some of the things that Oklahoma State was doing defensively to make Taylor Green think a little bit, disguise some coverages and things. You may not have the Jimmies and Joes that Arkansas has, but I do think the dynamic of the offense and all the different, the different looks that they have, and finding some sort of balance to at least slow the game down, so to make Arkansas have to throw a little bit more. But I think for UAB going into this matchup, you're kind of playing with house money. Like it's an SEC school. We've seen some upsets happen over the years. Now's your chance, because Arkansas could have Oklahoma State still on their brain, still lingering on their mind, and they let Oklahoma State beat them twice. And you hear that old adage of, don't let one team beat you twice because of how you perform the next week. And if UAB kind of comes out and establish something offensively, I think that they could probably keep it interesting, but they are playing in an uphill battle. For sure.
Absolutely. And if you're UAB, in my opinion, show that you're headed in the right direction, right? Because we know that what this offense is capable of. We didn't see it last week, but we know what this offense is capable of. But what can this defense do to limit what looks like a very, very explosive offense under Bobby Petrino and Taylor Green there in Arkansas? That's going to be an interesting one to watch. And you got some other great games on the SEC slate that we don't have time to get to, but you've got, of course, the ranked matchup. You got Boston College going to take on Missouri. That's one that I know is going to be interesting for a lot of people. You have Ole Miss taking on Wake Forest, which I know it's just Wake Forest in a lot of people's minds, but it's your first Power 4 competition for Ole Miss. Maybe we learn a little something more about them. But it's going to be a great week 3 of the college football season getting underway again. Alabama traveling to Wisconsin, Auburn taking on New Mexico here in Jordan-Hare, UAB on the road taking on Arkansas. It's going to be a great week 3 here in the SEC and around Birmingham football. So appreciate you tuning in for Countdown to Kickoff. That does it for Conrad Van Order, Damian Mitchell. We'll be back with you next week here on Jocks 94.5.